I had never been a frequent bus rider. The bus system in the city was outdated, and with my job and car, I rarely found myself in need of public transportation. But on that day, the rain had been relentless, and my car's battery had died. I had no choice but to walk to the bus stop, hoping I wouldn't be late for an important meeting. The first few minutes were uneventful. I stood at the bus stop, watching the rain fall in sheets, knowing I could be waiting a while. The bus schedule wasn't exactly reliable, but when I saw the bus approaching, an old, rusty number 42, I was relieved. I hopped on, paid my fare, and found an empty seat near the back. The driver didn't look up when I boarded, his face obscured by a large pair of sunglasses, even though it was a dreary afternoon. I glanced around at the passengers, a mix of tired commuters, the occasional elderly person, and a few people I didn't recognize. No one was talking, and the air was thick with a sense of quiet discomfort. I sank into my seat and closed my eyes for a moment, feeling the exhaustion of the day catch up with me. When I opened my eyes again, something felt different. I couldn't place it at first. The city outside the window had changed. The familiar streets were gone, replaced by winding roads lined with trees, their branches twisted like the fingers of some ancient being. The buildings had disappeared too, replaced by large, looming structures that looked like old factories or warehouses, with broken windows and rusting metal doors. It was as if we had crossed into another world entirely. The bus was no longer moving through the city, it was driving through a dense forest, the path barely wide enough for the bus to pass through. I sat up straight in my seat, staring out the window, unsure of what I was seeing. I glanced at the other passengers. They hadn't seemed to notice anything strange at all. They sat there, as if this was normal, as if nothing was out of place. I felt a chill run through me. My stop was approaching, but I had no idea where we were or where we were headed. I could see the road winding ahead of us, the trees pressing in on either side, the sky darkening with an eerie kind of stillness. I looked up at the driver, still hidden behind his dark sunglasses. He hadn't moved, and I couldn't see his face clearly. I called out asking what the next stop was, my voice trembling slightly. He didn't respond. His hands remained firmly on the wheel, guiding the bus with a kind of precision that felt too practiced, too deliberate. The other passengers didn't stir, not even when I spoke. It was as if they couldn't hear me. It was as if they didn't care. I pressed the button for the stop, my anxiety growing with every passing moment. The bus didn't slow down. In fact, it sped up, as if it were rushing to reach an unknown destination. I turned to the person sitting next to me, an older man with a thin gray beard and a hunched back. He had a faint smell of cigarettes and cheap cologne. I asked him the same question I had asked the driver. I asked where we were going with my voice barely a whisper. He didn't turn to look at me, but his lips twitched into a faint, unsettling smile. He then muttered that it's not about where we're going. It's about where we've been, almost to himself. I stared at him, not understanding what he meant. He didn't elaborate. He just kept staring straight ahead, his hands gripping the seat in front of him with unnerving intensity. The trees outside grew denser, and the sky darkened, as if we were entering some kind of twilight zone, a place that existed outside of time and space. The buildings we passed were older, more decayed. Some looked like they had been abandoned for decades, others as if they were never finished at all. There was something off about everything, a palpable sense that the world around us wasn't real. I tried again to ask the driver to stop, but my voice caught in my throat. It was as if the words were being swallowed by the air, disappearing before they even left my lips. No one seemed to notice, and the bus continued to barrel down the road, its headlights cutting through the minutes, hours. Time seemed to stretch and fold in on itself. I couldn't tell how long we'd been on the bus, or where we were headed. The trees outside had all but swallowed the road, and the faint sound of something in the distance, A low hum, almost like a heartbeat, was starting to get louder, reverberating through the walls of the bus. I tried to stand, but my legs felt like lead. The other passengers were all still, but their faces somehow seemed different now. Their eyes were wide and their expressions vacant, their gazes locked on the empty road ahead, but their faces held a quiet terror, one I hadn't seen before. Something was wrong, I realized. Something had changed in all of them, just as it had changed in me. I had to get off the bus. I couldn't stay on this ride any longer. I stumbled toward the front, pushing past the passengers, my mind racing, my hands trembling. I reached the front of the bus, my heart pounding in my chest, and slammed my hand against the driver's side window. The bus didn't stop. In fact, it didn't even seem to notice me. The driver didn't acknowledge me at all. He simply continued driving, eyes hidden behind his sunglasses, his hands steady on the wheel. Then, in a moment of pure instinct, I grabbed the door handle and yanked it. The door clicked open with an unnatural ease, and I tumbled out onto the road, the cold air hitting my face like a slap. I stood there for a moment, disoriented, watching the bus continue down the road without slowing. The headlights disappeared into the night, leaving only a faint, eerie hum in the distance. I stood alone, the quiet of the night pressing in around me. There was no sign of the bus anymore. It had vanished as if it had never been there at all. I looked around, but there was nothing familiar in sight. The forest loomed around me, dark and endless, stretching in every direction. I had no idea where I was, but I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't going to get back on that bus. As I turned to walk away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Something was watching me from the shadows, and that hum, it was still there, faint but growing louder. I had left the bus, but somehow I knew I hadn't truly escaped. It was just another night when I stepped onto the bus, exhausted after a long shift at work. The city lights flickered as the rain pelted the windows of the bus stop. I didn't expect anything unusual, just a ride home. The bus was almost empty, just a few tired souls scattered in the seats, faces illuminated by their phones. I took a seat by the window, trying to ignore the drumming of the rain as it slid down the glass. The driver gave a brief nod when I paid my fare, but there was something odd about him. His movements were stiff, like someone who had been sitting in the same position for too long. His face was hidden behind dark sunglasses, despite the dimness outside. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I chalked it up to exhaustion. The bus began its journey. As it picked up speed, the usual cityscape outside began to blur. The streets I was so familiar with started to distort. The tall office buildings and rows of apartments faded, replaced by narrow, winding roads lined with trees that seemed to reach out like arms. I glanced at the other passengers. There was a man sitting across from me, hunched over, his face obscured by a hoodie. He wasn't looking at his phone or reading a book. He just stared ahead, motionless. There was a woman near the back, sitting completely still, her eyes glazed over, and her hands folded neatly on her lap. Nobody spoke. It was as though the bus was a world apart, and the people within it were trapped in some quiet, unspoken agreement. The bus continued down the winding road, and the sounds outside seemed to fade away. I tried to shake the unease building in my stomach, but couldn't ignore the growing tension in the air. The driver didn't speak, didn't make any attempts to acknowledge the passengers. His grip on the wheel was unnaturally tight, his knuckles white, and his shoulders stiff. The hum of the bus's engine became louder, almost drowning out everything else. I looked out the window, expecting to see something familiar, maybe a landmark or a street sign that would reassure me I was still on the right route. But the landscape outside was entirely alien. Instead of city lights and familiar signs, there was nothing but trees and darkness, stretching on endlessly. The road curved sharply, dipping into a valley. The bus didn't slow, just continued to race through the night. I had never seen this area before. I had lived in the city for years, and this was not a part of town I recognized. The buildings had given way to dense woods. The streetlights were few and far between, their faint glow barely enough to make out the road ahead. The air inside the bus felt colder, the silence thicker. I looked around, but nobody seemed to notice anything odd. The man with the hoodie still hadn't moved, and the woman at the back of the bus was staring straight ahead, her expression unreadable. It felt as though we were in a void somewhere outside of time. After what felt like an eternity, I glanced at the clock, but the time didn't make sense. The minutes seemed to crawl, yet the hands of the clock spun erratically, as if it couldn't decide what time it was. I felt my heart rate quicken as my fingers began to sweat. I needed to get off the bus, to feel something familiar again, to snap out of this nightmare. I pressed the button for my stop, but the bus didn't slow down. It didn't even acknowledge my request. Panic rose in my chest and I pressed it again and again. Nothing. The driver didn't even glance at the rearview mirror. The hum of the bus continued, louder now, and the trees outside had become even more unnerving, darker, more twisted, as if they were bending toward us. I stood up, my legs shaky, and moved toward the front of the bus. I had to find out what was happening. Something was wrong, something was deeply wrong, and I needed answers. The closer I got to the driver, the more I could feel the weight of his presence. There was something about him, something in the way he didn't move, didn't acknowledge the outside world at all. His hands were gripping the wheel, his shoulders hunched in a stiff manner. His head remained tilted forward slightly, eyes hidden behind the dark lenses of his glasses. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do next. I tapped on the glass partition separating us. There was no response. I knocked louder, but there was no reaction. At this point, I could feel my pulse thumping in my throat. What was happening? Why wasn't anyone acknowledging me? I felt something shift in the air, a thickening of the atmosphere. The trees outside had begun to move. At first I thought it was just the wind, but then I realized no. These trees weren't swaying in the breeze. They were bending toward the bus, their branches reaching, stretching in unnatural angles as if they were trying to pull us into the forest. Suddenly the man in the hoodie stirred. He looked up slowly, his eyes meeting mine. His gaze was empty, hollow, no recognition, no emotion, just that vacant stare. He whispered, but it wasn't words, it was something darker, something I couldn't understand. I stumbled back, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The other passengers hadn't moved. They were all staring ahead, frozen, unblinking. They didn't seem like people anymore. They were just husks, trapped in the same eerie loop as the bus. The air grew colder, the darkness outside pressing in closer, and the bus continued forward, its lights cutting through the suffocating blackness. I turned toward the door, desperate to get off, to escape. I grabbed the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It felt as though it was locked, as if the bus itself were holding us in. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something at the front of the bus. A figure, barely visible through the rearview mirror. It was moving toward us, walking along the side of the road, its silhouette just a blur. It was tall, impossibly tall, and it seemed to move with a jerking, unnatural gait, as though it were not quite in sync with the world around it. The figure got closer, and I saw something that made my blood run cold. It had no face, no eyes, no mouth, just smooth, featureless skin. It didn't belong in this world. I screamed, a panic-stricken sound that echoed through the bus, but nobody reacted. Nobody even blinked. I hammered on the door, but the bus didn't slow down. The figure was almost upon us. I turned to the driver, but the driver was now no longer there. The seat was empty, the man in sunglasses gone. I could see only darkness in the front of the bus, a hollow, endless void. The hum grew louder, and the figure outside, now at the window, grinned, a grin too wide, too twisted to be human. I collapsed to the floor in fear, my heart racing. I had no idea how long I had been on this bus, how far we had traveled, or if we were even still in the same reality. But I knew one thing for certain: there was no getting off this ride. It began as an ordinary day, one where I was just trying to get to work. The sun had barely risen, and the streets were still cold with the early morning chill. I was running late, so I hurried to catch the subway, my mind racing with the usual worries of the day. I had no idea then that this would be the day my world would shift, like stepping through a door that led somewhere it shouldn't. I slid my card through the turnstile and waited for the train to arrive. The platform was sparsely populated, save for a few commuters lost in their phones, heads down, eyes glazed. The train, when it arrived, was almost empty, an unusual occurrence for rush hour. The doors opened, and I stepped in, hoping for a quiet ride. I found an empty seat near the window and leaned back, allowing the familiar rattling of the train to lull me into a sense of comfort. The train began to move, and for a moment it felt like any other ride. But soon something was wrong. I couldn't place it at first, just a subtle shift in the air. The lights flickered, dimming for a split second. I looked around, noticing that the other passengers had not reacted. The rhythmic motion of the train, the squeal of the wheels on the tracks, the hum of the lights, all of it felt wrong. But I couldn't put my finger on why. The train slowed as it approached a station, one I didn't recognize. The name of the station wasn't displayed anywhere. The usual digital sign showing the upcoming stops was blank. There was a faint buzzing noise, as though the lights themselves were struggling to stay on. My heart started to beat a little faster. I didn't live near this station, nor did I know of any stops along the route that had no name. The doors opened with a hiss, and I could see the platform ahead, a place that seemed unfamiliar but oddly still. No one else got off. No one else. The train door remained open for longer than usual, the silence growing heavier. Something about this felt wrong, like I was being drawn into a place I had no business being. The train jerked forward again, its movement slower than usual. The next station came and went without a stop. Then another and another. I started to feel the first twinge of panic. I pressed the emergency button by my seat, but there was no response. The train kept going, faster now, as if it was accelerating, as if it were moving away from something. The noise changed. The familiar sound of the train's wheels against the track became distorted, warping into a low hum, as if the train were no longer running on any normal system. The lights flickered again, longer this time. A sharp, electrical crackle cut through the air, and the whole train seemed to stutter, like a machine on the brink of failing. But it didn't stop. It didn't slow down. The seats around me were still empty, and the stillness in the air was so thick that I could almost taste it. I stood up, my knees weak, and walked to the door, wanting to get off to find some explanation for what was happening. But when I pressed the button to open the door, nothing happened. I turned the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The train's interior remained eerily silent, and I noticed a strange shift in the air. The temperature had dropped drastically, and I could see my breath in front of me. It wasn't just the cold, it was as if the air itself was thickening, compressing, becoming heavier. It felt like I was descending deeper into something, a place where the usual rules no longer applied. I turned back toward the window. The outside was a blur of darkness, no longer the familiar cityscape. The train was traveling through what seemed like an endless tunnel. But this tunnel wasn't the usual underground one. This tunnel had no end. It stretched out forever, its walls flickering in and out of sight. Sometimes I would catch glimpses of shadows moving along the edges of the train, like fleeting figures just out of reach, but whenever I tried to focus on them, they disappeared. I returned to my seat, my thoughts racing. I couldn't understand it. How could a subway train be running with no clear destination? How could I be stuck in a tunnel that seemed to stretch forever? Time began to lose all meaning. I couldn't tell how long I had been on the train. The feeling of isolation began to claw at me. I stood again, walking the length of the train, hoping to find someone, anyone, who could tell me what was going on. But the car was empty. There were no other passengers, no conductor, just me and the relentless movement of the train. I checked my phone, but there was no signal, no bars, no Wi-Fi, just an empty screen. I pulled at the emergency button again, desperate, but again, no response. The doors wouldn't open, the intercom was silent, and the dim lights above me flickered intermittently, casting long, wavering shadows across the train. As I walked to the front of the train, I caught a glimpse of something in the reflection of the window. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. It wasn't just the shadows. The reflection showed something standing at the end of the car, something tall and thin, its form obscured by darkness. I stumbled backward, my hands grasping at the cold metal poles for balance. The figure in the reflection didn't move, didn't acknowledge me. It just stood there, watching. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished. The reflection was clear again, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave. I felt a deep, primal fear settle in my chest, and I knew, deep down, that something was wrong. Something was wrong. The train had become a prison, and there was no way out. The train continued its journey, faster now, as if it were being pulled toward a destination I couldn't understand. The walls of the tunnel were becoming more distorted, the darkness more absolute. The air felt heavier, pressing in on me from all sides. I felt a tremor in the ground beneath me, followed by an unsettling screech, a tearing sound like metal grinding against metal. The train lurched forward, its brakes screeching, but still it didn't stop. And then, in the distance, I saw something. A faint light, too faint, too far to be real, but the train was speeding toward it, toward the light that seemed to shimmer in the distance. I had no choice but to wait. The train wouldn't stop. It couldn't stop. The light grew closer, and I realized that there was only one truth: I would have to reach that light, wherever it led. And if the train didn't stop, I would be carried with it, whether I wanted to go or not. And as the light grew brighter, I knew that the end of this journey, wherever it led, would be a place I was not meant to find. I had always been one to catch the late-night bus. It was quiet, peaceful even. The city, just beginning to wind down, gave the ride a certain solitude. I would often get on the same bus, Route 53, the one that ran through the heart of the city before heading to the outskirts, a quiet stretch of highway that always made me feel like I was leaving the world behind. The driver was an older man who had been working the same shift for as long as I could remember. His eyes were tired, his movements slow, but always steady. That night, I boarded the bus around midnight, just as I always did. There were only a few passengers: an elderly woman clutching a shopping bag, a young man with headphones in, staring out the window, and a man in the back, hunched over, his coat pulled tightly around him. I sat near the middle, away from the others, watching the lights from the city fade behind us. The bus moved steadily, the quiet hum of the engine lulling me into a kind of trance. The driver didn't speak, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. The lights of the city passed us, the streets growing emptier, quieter. But there was something about the night that felt different, something I couldn't quite shake. As the bus reached the outskirts of town, the route veered into a part of the city I had never paid much attention to. It was a part of town that had always seemed distant, foreign. The streets were darker here, the buildings looming, like hollowed-out shells of their former selves. Then, as the bus slowed to a stop at a stretch of road I didn't recognize, I felt it, the sudden drop in temperature. It wasn't a chill from the outside air, but a strange, unnatural cold that seemed to seep into the bus itself. The kind of cold that made your skin prickle, your breath catch in your throat. I glanced out the window, expecting to see the usual stretch of empty highway, the dimly lit street lamps, but what I saw instead made my stomach turn. There were no streetlights here, no familiar landmarks, just a blackness that seemed to stretch on forever. The road ahead was a dark void, as though the bus was about to drive straight into the nothingness. I turned toward the driver, but he was no longer focused on the road. He was looking out the windshield, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. The young man with the headphones was still staring out the window, his expression now vacant, his face pale as if drained of color. The elderly woman, too, seemed unnerved, her hands tightly gripping her bag. And the man in the back, his head was no longer bent down in his coat. He was sitting up now, staring directly at me. His eyes were wide and unblinking. His gaze held no warmth, no emotion, just a hollow, empty stare that sent a chill crawling up my spine. It was as if he knew something that I didn't, something terrifying. Suddenly the bus jolted forward. I looked out the window again, my heart pounding as I realized we were moving faster than before. The road ahead was still nothing but darkness, but the bus was speeding into it, as if something was pulling us forward. The lights flickered, casting long, jagged shadows on the walls of the bus, making the whole space feel smaller, more claustrophobic. Then, the man in the back spoke, not directly to anyone, but loud enough for the rest of us to hear. His voice was slow, deliberate. He said we shouldn't be there and that. No one ever comes back from this road. The bus grew still, the air thickening with tension. I looked around at the other passengers. The elderly woman was trembling, her lips moving silently, as though praying. The young man had taken off his headphones, his eyes darting nervously from one person to the next. And the driver, he had stopped looking ahead. His gaze had shifted to the rearview mirror, and his face was pale, his eyes wide, filled with a kind of panic that I had never seen in him before. The man continued, his words now heavy, almost suffocating in the small space, by saying the road leads nowhere and that there's no end. He added that we'll keep going until we disappear. I was frozen in my seat, my heart racing. The bus moved faster now, the engine whining in protest as we tore through the darkness. The lights of the bus flickered again, this time going out completely for a few seconds before coming back on. But in that brief moment of darkness, I saw something, a shadow darker than the night itself, moving outside the window, just outside the reach of the light. It was large, its shape indistinct, but I felt its presence like a weight pressing down on me. The bus lurched again, this time sending me sliding across the seat. I grabbed the armrest, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The elderly woman was crying now, softly, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. The young man was clutching the seat in front of him, his fingers white, as if he was trying to hold on to reality itself. And then I saw it. Just for a moment, in the corner of the window, there was a figure, tall, dark, and unmistakably human, standing on the side of the road. But it wasn't human, not in the way I understood. It was wrong. The shape was twisted, contorted, its limbs unnaturally long, its body hunched. Its face, if it had one, was hidden in shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and unblinking. I turned to look at the others, my mouth dry, my voice failing me. The bus had stopped. Not at a station, not at a traffic light, just stopped. The engine had gone silent. Outside, the figure was gone. The world beyond the windows was black, empty. The man in the back leaned forward, his face twisted into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He said we're stuck, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. He then continued to say there's no way back and that there's nowhere left to go. The bus sat motionless, suspended between places, between realities. I could hear the sound of my own breathing, slow and steady, as though time itself had stopped. The air was thick now, heavy with something unnameable, something ancient. And then, just as quickly as it had all started, the bus jerked back into motion. The lights flickered one last time before settling into an eerie, steady glow. The dark road outside was gone, replaced by the familiar city streets, the buildings, the neon signs. I looked around the bus. The other passengers were gone. The elderly woman, the young man, the man in the back, all of them gone. The driver, now calm, turned to glance at me as we approached the next stop. His eyes were empty, as though the encounter had never happened. He didn't say a word as I stepped off the bus, my legs unsteady, my heart still racing. The night air was cool against my skin, and I looked around. The city seemed normal again. The streets were full of life, of sound, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I knew deep down that the ride I had just taken was not one that could be explained, and as I walked away, I could hear the faint hum of the bus engine in the distance, still moving forward, still lost in the dark. There was something